Before you judge me for telling this story, ask yourself, how far would you go to survive when the very food meant to cure you becomes your prison? The winter of 1894 descended upon Chicago with a vengeance that seemed almost biblical. Snow piled high against the brick facades of the city's newer buildings, while smoke from 1,000 chimneys painted the sky in shades of gray and black. The world's Columbian Exposition had closed its doors just months before, leaving the city with a peculiar mixture of pride and emptiness, as if Chicago had shown the world its brightest face and now had to live with the ordinary reflection staring back. It was on one of these frozen February mornings that Sarah Whitmore stepped off the Illinois Central Railroad at the Van Buren Street station, clutching a worn leather satchel and a letter of employment that had arrived 3 weeks prior. At 26, Sarah possessed the kind of practical beauty that emerged from competence rather than vanity. Brown hair pulled back in a sensible bun, gray eyes that missed little, and hands that bore the calluses of someone who had worked since childhood. She had trained as a nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital, where she'd learned that medicine was equal parts science and compassion, though the doctors there seemed to prioritize the former over the latter. Before continuing, check right now if you're already subscribed to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to see if there's someone from my city here. The letter from Dr. Alistair Kellner had been unexpected but welcome. Sarah's mother had recently passed from consumption, leaving debts that threatened to consume what little remained of the Whitmore family estate in Boston. The position at Ashcroft Sanatorium offered not only a generous salary but also room and board, a fresh start in a city that promised opportunity to those brave enough to seize it. Miss Whitmore, a young man approached her on the platform, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. He wore a simple brown coat and a cap pulled low over his forehead. "I'm Thomas Beck, driver for the sanatorium. Dr. Kellner sent me to collect you." Sarah nodded, grateful that someone had come despite the weather. Thomas took her satchel and led her to a black carriage waiting outside the station. As they traveled northwest through the city streets, Sarah watched Chicago unfold before her. The bustling markets of the Loop, the grand department stores, the mixture of prosperity and poverty that characterized every growing American city. Children played in the snow-covered streets while their mothers hurried past with baskets of goods. Street vendors called out their wares despite the cold. After nearly an hour, the urban landscape began to thin. They passed through neighborhoods where houses grew more sparse, where empty lots interrupted the grid of civilization. Finally, they turned onto a private road lined with bare oak trees, their branches forming skeletal arches overhead. "The sanatorium is just ahead, miss," Thomas said, speaking for the first time since they'd left the station. His voice carried an odd flatness, as if he were reciting memorized lines. The Ashcroft Sanatorium emerged from the winter landscape like something from a Gothic novel. It was a massive 3-story structure built of gray stone, with towers at each corner and narrow windows that seemed to peer out suspiciously at the world. The architecture suggested a fortress more than a place of healing, with thick walls and heavy doors designed to keep something either in or out. A wrought iron fence surrounded the entire property, and Sarah noticed that the gates closed behind them with a decisive clang. "Impressive, isn't it?" Thomas said, though his tone suggested something other than admiration. "Dr. Kellner designed it himself. Says the architecture promotes proper moral alignment." Before Sarah could ask what that meant, the main doors opened and a tall figure emerged, descending the stone steps with theatrical precision. Dr. Alistair Kellner was a man who commanded attention without demanding it. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with a lean frame that suggested both discipline and denial. His face was angular, dominated by piercing blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they encountered. He wore a pristine white coat over a black suit, and his beard was trimmed with geometric precision. "Miss Whitmore," his voice boomed across the courtyard, rich and resonant like a preacher addressing his congregation. Welcome to Ashcroft. Welcome to the future of human wellness and moral rectitude. Sarah stepped down from the carriage, suddenly aware of how travel-worn she must appear. Dr. Kellner, I'm honored to join your staff. Your work comes highly recommended. Kellner's smile was broad but somehow failed to reach his eyes. The honor is ours, my dear. Come inside. Thomas will bring your belongings. We have much to discuss, and you must be exhausted from your journey. The interior of Ashcroft matched the exterior's austere grandeur. The entrance hall featured marble floors and walls painted in muted shades of cream and grey. There were no paintings or decorations, nothing to distract from the building's severe functionality. The air smelled of lye soap and something else Sarah couldn't quite identify, something vaguely medicinal but with an undertone that made her throat tighten. Doctor. Kellner led her through a series of corridors, speaking rapidly as they walked. Ashcroft represents a revolution in the treatment of both mental and physical ailments, Miss Whitmore. While others cling to outdated notions of humors and bloodletting, we embrace the scientific truth that the human body is a machine, and like any machine, it requires proper fuel and maintenance. They passed several patients in the hallways, men and women dressed in identical gray cotton gowns, moving slowly as if underwater. Their eyes seemed unfocused, their expressions vacant. None of them acknowledged Sarah or the doctor. Our patients suffer from a variety of complaints, Kellner continued. But the root cause is always the same: moral degeneracy expressed through physical symptoms. Neurasthenia, hysteria, melancholia, nervous exhaustion, all stem from improper living. The modern diet, Miss Whitmore, is poison. Meat inflames the baser passions. Sugar excites unnatural urges. Even spices stimulate thoughts better left dormant. He stopped before a set of double doors and turned to face her directly. Here at Ashcroft, we cure not just the body, but the soul. Through proper nutrition, rigorous routine, and moral education, we return our patients to society as better versions of themselves. The doors opened into what appeared to be the main dining hall. Long wooden tables filled the space, each set with neat rows of bowls and cups. The room was spotlessly clean, almost sterile, with more of those narrow windows high on the walls allowing thin streams of grey light to enter. This is where transformation begins, Kellner said, gesturing expansively. Every morning, our patients break their fast with nature's perfect food, grain, prepared according to my own specifications. No butter, no salt, no corruption of any kind. Just pure, wholesome cereal that nourishes without exciting. Sarah examined one of the bowls, which contained what looked like flakes of compressed grain, dry and colorless. And this diet alone produces results? Combined with our other treatments, yes. We employ hydrotherapy, exercise regimens, and what I call moral fortification sessions. But the diet is fundamental. You see, Miss Whitmore, I have discovered something that the medical establishment refuses to acknowledge. Consumption of animal flesh and stimulating foods creates moral weakness. Remove these corrupting influences, and the natural goodness of the human spirit emerges. He picked up one of the bowls and held it reverently, as if it contained something sacred rather than dried grain. This cereal is more than food, Miss Whitmore. It is redemption in edible form. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold outside. There was something about Kellner's intensity, the fervor in his eyes when he spoke about his dietary theories, that reminded her less of a doctor and more of a zealot. I understand you'll want to rest after your journey, Kellner said, setting down the bowl. Mrs. Harriet Grayson, our head matron, will show you to your quarters and explain your duties. We dine at 6 o'clock sharp. You'll join us, of course. I'm eager to hear your impressions of our facility. A severe-looking woman in her 50s appeared as if summoned, her face a map of deep lines and disapproval. Mrs. Grayson wore a black dress with a white apron, and her gray hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features. Miss Whitmore, she said curtly, her Boston accent marking her as a fellow New Englander. Follow me." As they walked through more corridors, Mrs. Grayson maintained a brisk pace and a running commentary delivered in clipped tones. Breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. No deviation. Patients are never to receive food outside these times. Your primary duty is to administer medications, assist with hydrotherapy sessions, and observe patients for signs of moral improvement or decline. Dr. Kellner reviews all observations personally. They climbed a narrow staircase to the 3rd floor, where the staff quarters were located. Sarah's room was small but adequate. A single bed, a washstand, a dresser, and one of those narrow windows that seemed to be Ashcroft's architectural signature. "You'll find uniforms in the dresser," Mrs. Grayson said. "We maintain strict standards of appearance. No jewelry, no perfumes, nothing that might stimulate unwholesome thoughts in patients. Your shifts begin at 6 in the morning and end at 9 in the evening, with 2 hours of rest in the afternoon." Questions? Sarah had dozens of questions, but she sensed that Mrs. Grayson was not the person to ask. "No, ma'am. Thank you." "Good. Be prompt for dinner. Dr. Kellner does not tolerate tardiness." With that, Mrs. Grayson departed, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. Alone in her new room, Sarah sat on the bed and looked out the window. The view showed only the winter landscape, snow-covered grounds surrounded by that imposing fence, and beyond it, the empty fields stretching toward the distant city. She thought about her mother, about the debt she'd left behind, about the promise of this new position. The salary was generous, the work important. So why did she feel like she'd just entered a prison rather than a place of healing? That evening, Sarah dressed in one of the provided uniforms, a simple gray dress with a white apron, similar to what Mrs. Grayson wore, and made her way to the staff dining room adjacent to the patient's hall. She arrived to find 5 other staff members already seated. Mrs. Grayson, Thomas Beck, 2 orderlies named Francis and Robert, and another nurse, a young woman who introduced herself as Margaret Price. Margaret seemed to be near Sarah's age, with kind eyes and a warm smile that was the first genuine expression Sarah had encountered at Ashcroft. "You'll get used to it," Margaret whispered as they took their seats. "The routine, the rules, all of it. Just don't ask too many questions, especially not of Dr. Kellner." Before Sarah could respond, Dr. Kellner entered, and everyone immediately fell silent. He took his place at the head of the table, surveyed his staff with those penetrating blue eyes, and smiled. "Let us begin," he said. The meal consisted of the same cereal Sarah had seen earlier, now served with hot water poured over it to create a thin gruel. There was also plain bread, boiled vegetables without seasoning, and water to drink. As Sarah forced down the flavorless meal, she watched Dr. Kellner eat with evident satisfaction, occasionally pausing to expound on his theories. "The tongue," he announced between bites, "is the gateway to corruption. Every pleasure we permit ourselves through taste leads inevitably to other darker pleasures. By training our palates to accept simplicity, we train our souls to resist temptation." The other staff members nodded and murmured agreement, though Sarah noticed that Margaret's expression remained carefully neutral. After dinner, Margaret offered to show Sarah around the patient wards. As they walked through the gaslit corridors, Margaret's cheerful demeanor faded slightly. "How long have you been here?" Sarah asked. 8 months, Margaret replied. "I came from Philadelphia. The pay was good, and I needed to get away from some things." They paused outside one of the patient rooms, where, through a small window in the door, Sarah could see a middle-aged woman sitting motionless on her bed, staring at nothing. "Mrs. Eleanor Thompson," Margaret said quietly. "Came here 6 months ago suffering from melancholia after her husband's death. Dr. Kellner promised her family he could restore her spirits through proper diet and moral guidance." "Has he?" Sarah asked. Margaret's silence was answer enough. They continued their tour, passing more patients in various states of listlessness. Some paced their rooms with mechanical repetition. Others sat as still as statues. A few slept, though it was barely 8 o'clock. What struck Sarah most was the absence of conversation or interaction. The patients moved and existed in isolation from one another, even when in the same space. "The diet does this?" Sarah asked. "Makes them so passive?" Margaret glanced around before answering, ensuring they were alone. "The diet is part of it, but there's more. Some patients receive special treatments, sessions with Dr. Kellner that the rest of us aren't permitted to attend. And sometimes the cereal itself seems different. I can't explain it, but I've noticed that patients who receive certain batches become more compliant, more distant. Different how? I don't know exactly. Dr. Kellner oversees all food preparation personally. He has a private kitchen in the basement where he creates his formulations. No one else is allowed in there." "But Sarah..." Margaret's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Patients disappear sometimes. Not many. Maybe one every few months. We're told they've been transferred to other facilities or released to family care, but I've never seen any paperwork. Never heard from any of them again." A cold dread settled in Sarah's stomach. "Have you reported this to anyone?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "To whom? Dr. Kellner owns this facility. The patients' families trust him completely. He's published papers, given lectures, been praised in medical journals. Who would believe a nurse's suspicions over his reputation?" Before Sarah could respond, they heard footsteps approaching. Mrs. Grayson appeared, her expression severe. "Miss Price, Miss Whitmore. Staff should be preparing for evening rounds, not gossiping in hallways." "Yes, ma'am," they both replied. As they separated to begin their duties, Margaret caught Sarah's arm briefly. "Be careful," she whispered. "Don't let the routine lull you. Stay alert." Sarah spent the rest of her first evening at Ashcroft, checking on patients, distributing evening medications, and trying to reconcile what she'd been taught about nursing with what she was witnessing. These patients weren't improving. They were fading, becoming less human with each passing day. Late that night, unable to sleep, Sarah stood at her window and looked out over the moonlit grounds. In the distance, she could see light coming from what must be the basement, Dr. Kellner's private kitchen, where he prepared his miraculous cereal. As she watched, a figure emerged carrying something heavy, something wrapped in canvas. Thomas Beck, she realized. And whatever he was carrying, he was taking it to a building beyond the main structure, a low stone structure that might have been a storage shed or root cellar. What was in that bundle? And why was it being moved in the middle of the night? Sarah returned to her bed, but didn't sleep. She'd come to Ashcroft seeking a fresh start, a chance to practice her profession in a progressive facility. Instead, she'd found something that made her every instinct scream warnings. Whatever was happening at the Ashcroft Sanatorium, it was far more sinister than dietary reform and moral education. And tomorrow, when she began her first full day of work, she would need to be very, very careful about what she discovered. Sarah's first week at Ashcroft passed in a blur of routine so rigid it seemed designed to prevent thought rather than encourage it. Wake at 5:30, dress in the grey uniform, attend morning staff prayer led by Dr. Kellner, who seemed to conflate medical science with religious fervor. Breakfast at 6, always the same flavorless cereal. Then 12 hours of patient care, broken only by the brief afternoon rest period and equally bland meals. The patients themselves remained the most disturbing aspect of Ashcroft. Sarah had worked in hospitals where she'd seen the ravages of disease and injury, the confusion of dementia, the despair of terminal illness. But this was different. These patients weren't suffering, they simply weren't fully present, as if some essential quality of their humanity had been diluted or drained away. On her 8th day, Sarah was assigned to assist with what Dr. Kellner called a purification session. The patient was a man named Henry Caldwell, a former railroad executive who had been committed by his wife for what the intake notes described as nervous exhaustion and moral weakness. Sarah had seen him during her rounds, a man in his early 40s who spent hours staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. The purification room was in the basement, down a staircase Sarah hadn't previously explored. The walls were thick stone, and the air grew colder with each step. At the bottom, a heavy wooden door opened into a space that seemed more laboratory than treatment room. Glass cabinets lined the walls, filled with bottles of various powders and liquids. A large metal tub dominated the center of the room, currently filled with water that steamed slightly in the cool air. But what caught Sarah's attention was the table against the far wall, covered with a white sheet that didn't quite conceal its contents. Strange metal instruments, syringes, and what appeared to be grinding equipment of some kind. Dr. Kellner was already there, along with Francis, one of the orderlies. They both wore heavy rubber aprons over their clothes. "Ah, Miss Whitmore," Kellner said, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. "Excellent timing. Today you'll observe one of our most effective treatments. Please, take notes. I may wish to publish a paper on this procedure." Henry Caldwell was led in by Robert, the other orderly. The patient moved slowly, unresisting, his expression vacant. He was stripped to his undergarments and helped into the metal tub without protest or apparent awareness of his surroundings. "Hydrotherapy has been recognized for centuries as beneficial," Kellner explained as he adjusted the water temperature. "But most practitioners fail to understand its true purpose. Cold water shocks the system, yes, but alternating temperatures, rapid shifts between hot and cold, can induce a state of profound moral receptivity." For the next 30 minutes, Sarah watched in growing horror as Henry Caldwell was subjected to water that shifted from nearly scalding to ice cold and back again, each transition marked by the patient's involuntary gasps and shudders. Dr. Kellner maintained a running commentary throughout, explaining how the treatment purged base impulses and opened the soul to higher guidance. But it was what happened afterward that truly disturbed Sarah. Once Henry was dried and dressed, Dr. Kellner had him sit in a chair facing a blank white wall. The doctor then stood behind him and began speaking in a low, rhythmic voice. Not quite a whisper, but something that seemed to bypass normal hearing and sink directly into the mind. "You are at peace," Kellner intoned. "Your struggles are meaningless. Your desires are obstacles. Obedience is freedom. Submission is strength. The food you receive is all you need. The words you hear are all the truth that exists." Henry's head began to nod slightly, his eyes unfocused and glassy. "Repeat after me. I am grateful for my purification." "I am grateful for my purification," Henry mumbled. "I will accept what I am given. I will accept what I am given. I will not question. I will not resist. I will become what Dr. Kellner knows I can be. I will not question. I will not resist. I will become what Dr. Kellner knows I can be." Sarah felt her hands trembling as she wrote notes that she knew would never actually form the basis of any legitimate medical paper. This wasn't treatment. It was breaking a human being down and rebuilding them according to Dr. Kellner's twisted vision. When the session finally ended, Henry was led away, moving with even less animation than before. Dr. Kellner removed his rubber apron and smiled at Sarah with evident satisfaction. "Remarkable progress, wouldn't you say?" When Mr. Caldwell first arrived, he was defiant, argumentative, insistent on his own perspective. Now look at him, calm, accepting, ready to receive proper moral instruction. "Dr. Kellner," Sarah said carefully, "I'm not certain this constitutes medical treatment. The patient seems less improved than diminished." Kellner's smile faded, his blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made Sarah's breath catch. "Miss Whitmore, you come from traditional medical training, which I understand. But you must unlearn what you think you know. The self that Mr. Caldwell presented to the world, that aggressive, lustful, greedy self. That was the disease. What you interpret as diminishment is actually the removal of corruption. We are not suppressing his true nature. We are revealing it by stripping away the false layers that society and poor diet have imposed. He moved closer, and Sarah fought the urge to step back. You will assist with many such sessions. I trust that in time you will understand the profound importance of our work. After all, you chose to come here. Surely that decision means something. The question hung in the air like a threat. Sarah nodded slowly. Of course, Doctor. Thank you for allowing me to observe. Good, good. Kellner's smile returned. Now, I believe it's time for the noon meal. You must be famished. But Sarah wasn't hungry. As she climbed the stairs back to the main floor, her stomach churned with revulsion. She needed to understand what was truly happening at Ashcroft, needed to find some way to help these patients, or at least document the abuse so that authorities could eventually intervene. That afternoon, during her rest period, Sarah sought out Margaret. She found her fellow nurse in the small staff common room, mending a torn uniform. Margaret, Sarah said quietly, closing the door behind her. I need to ask you something. Have you ever assisted with Dr. Kellner's purification sessions? Margaret's hands stilled on her sewing. She glanced toward the door, then nodded. 3 times. I stopped volunteering after the 3rd. Mrs. Grayson now handles most of those assignments. Then you've seen what he does. The water torture. The mental conditioning. It's worse than conditioning, Margaret whispered. It's erasure. Whatever makes a person uniquely themselves, their will, their personality, their resistance, he systematically destroys it. And the cereal, Sarah. I'm certain now that he adds something to it, something that makes the patients more susceptible to his methods. Sarah pulled a chair close. Have you ever been in his private kitchen? No one goes in there except Dr. Kellner and sometimes Mrs. Grayson. But I've seen the results. Patients on certain batches of the cereal become compliant within days. Others, the ones who resist his treatments, who maintain their sense of self, those are the ones who disappear. Where do they go? Margaret's face went pale. I don't know. But Sarah, I've been keeping track. 7 patients have vanished since I arrived. 7 people who were difficult, who argued, who refused to eat the special cereal. One day they're here, the next they're simply gone. And when I've asked Mrs. Grayson, she says they've been transferred or released, but there's never any record. No transfer papers, no signatures from family members. Before Sarah could respond, they heard footsteps in the hallway. Margaret quickly resumed her sewing, and Sarah picked up a medical journal, pretending to read. Mrs. Grayson passed by the open door, her sharp eyes scanning the room before she continued down the corridor. We need to be more careful, Margaret breathed. If Dr. Kellner suspects we're questioning his methods... She didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. Whatever happened to resistant patients might also happen to resistant staff. That night, Sarah lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of Ashcroft after dark. The building creaked and settled. Occasionally she heard footsteps in distant corridors. Once, she thought she heard crying, but it might have been the wind. She thought about her mother, about how she'd trusted doctors who ultimately couldn't save her. She thought about the promise of modern medicine, the belief that science and reason could solve humanity's suffering. Dr. Kellner believed that too, in his own twisted way. He genuinely seemed to think he was helping his patients, saving them from themselves. But Sarah knew the difference between healing and harm. And what was happening in the basement of Ashcroft, what was being served in those bowls of bland cereal, what was being done to human beings in the name of moral purity, that was harm dressed up in the language of salvation. The next few days, Sarah paid closer attention to the patients' meals. She noticed that the cereal wasn't uniform. Some bowls contained the standard pale flakes, while others held what appeared to be the same thing but with slightly different coloring, a faint grey undertone that might go unnoticed unless one was specifically looking for it. She also observed which patients received which bowls. The pattern became clear. Those deemed progressing well received the standard cereal, while those classified as resistant or morally challenged received the grey-tinted version. And invariably, within days of consuming the altered cereal, even the most difficult patients became docile and compliant. On her 14th day at Ashcroft, Sarah made a decision that she knew was dangerous but felt morally necessary. During the noon meal service, while other staff members were distracted, she took a small sample of the grey-tinted cereal and wrapped it in a handkerchief, hiding it in her uniform pocket. She had a former classmate from nursing school who now worked at a laboratory in Chicago. If she could get the sample analyzed, if she could prove that Dr. Kellner was drugging his patients with something beyond normal food. But how could she leave the grounds? Staff were permitted 1 day off per month, and Sarah's first wouldn't come for another 2 weeks. Sending it by post seemed too risky. The mail was handled by Thomas, who seemed utterly loyal to Dr. Kellner. That evening, as Sarah was completing her rounds, she heard voices coming from Dr. Kellner's office. The door was slightly ajar, and though she knew she shouldn't eavesdrop, something made her pause in the shadows of the hallway. "The Peterson woman is proving difficult." Mrs. Grayson's voice sharp with irritation. "She refuses the enriched cereal, claims it makes her feel strange. She's been asking to contact her family." "How long has she been here?" Dr. Kellner's voice, thoughtful rather than concerned. 5 weeks. Her husband committed her for hysteria and nervous complaints. He's paid for 6 months of treatment. And her response to the purification sessions? Minimal. She maintains her personality, her resistance. "I believe she may be beyond redemption, Doctor." A pause. Then Kellner spoke again, his tone cold and clinical. "Then we must consider alternative uses for Mrs. Peterson. The current batch of enriched formula is running low, and I prefer to use fresh materials when possible. Begin reducing her standard meals. We'll proceed with the transition in 3 days." Sarah's blood ran cold. Alternative uses, fresh materials, transition. Margaret's suspicions about disappearing patients suddenly took on a horrifying new dimension. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, barely breathing, as the conversation continued. "What about the new nurse, Miss Whitmore?" Mrs. Grayson asked. "She asks too many questions. I've seen her watching the meal preparations." "Miss Whitmore comes from traditional training," Kellner replied. "She'll adapt in time, or she'll prove herself unsuitable. For now, let her observe. Sometimes seeing the full scope of our work converts the most skeptical minds. And if she doesn't convert?" Another pause, longer this time. "Then she'll contribute to our mission in another capacity. We waste nothing here at Ashcroft, Mrs. Grayson, nothing and no one." Sarah didn't wait to hear more. She moved as quietly as possible down the hallway, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. When she reached the safety of her room, she locked the door and sat on her bed, trying to process what she'd heard. Fresh materials, alternative uses, the grey cereal that made patients compliant, the grinding equipment she'd seen in the purification room, the heavy bundle Thomas had carried in the middle of the night. The pieces assembled themselves into a picture so horrifying that Sarah's mind initially rejected it. But the more she thought about it, the more everything made terrible sense. Dr. Kellner wasn't just drugging his patients, he was using them. Those who resisted, who couldn't be broken down and rebuilt according to his vision of moral purity. They weren't being transferred or released. They were being processed, ground up, mixed into the very cereal that was supposed to be nature's perfect food. The patients of Ashcroft were being fed their former fellow inmates. Sarah rushed to the wash basin and vomited up her evening meal, retching until nothing remained but bile. She thought about every meal she'd eaten since arriving, every bowl of that flavorless cereal. Had she consumed? No. She forced herself to think clearly. The standard cereal was likely just grain. It was the special batches, the gray-tinted ones given to difficult patients, that contained the horrific secret ingredient. Doctor? Kellner's theory about diet-controlling morals had taken a cannibalistic turn. He believed that consuming the physical substance of reformed patients would transfer their newly acquired obedience to those still resistant. It was insane. It was monstrous. It was happening. And Sarah was trapped in the middle of it. She spent the rest of the night sitting by her window, watching the dark grounds, trying to formulate a plan. She couldn't simply leave. Abandoning her post would raise questions, and besides, she had no proof of what she'd discovered. The sample of cereal in her pocket might contain drugs, but it wouldn't prove cannibalism unless specifically tested for human tissue, and what laboratory would even think to look for that? She needed more evidence. She needed to access Dr. Kellner's private kitchen to see with her own eyes what he was doing. But how could she manage that without being caught? As dawn broke over Ashcroft, painting the snow-covered grounds in shades of grey and pink, Sarah made a decision. She would find a way into that basement kitchen. She would document what she found, and then she would burn this place to the ground, consequences be damned. But first, she had to make Dr. Kellner believe she was adapting to his vision, becoming a true believer in his cause. She had to pretend to be converted while maintaining her humanity. It was, she realized, exactly what he was doing to his patients, except Sarah would be doing it in reverse, maintaining her true self while presenting a false facade. She just hoped she was a better actor than she was a liar. Because if Dr. Kellner saw through her performance, she would become the next ingredient in his miraculous breakfast cereal. The following 2 weeks were perhaps the most difficult of Sarah's life. Every morning, she forced herself to eat the standard cereal, all the while wondering if Dr. Kellner might decide she needed the enriched version. Every day, she assisted with purification sessions, watching human beings systematically broken down, and she smiled and nodded and took dutiful notes. Every evening she listened to Dr. Kellner expound on his theories during staff meals, and she asked thoughtful questions that suggested growing understanding rather than growing horror. It was Margaret who finally provided the opportunity Sarah needed. "Mrs. Grayson is taking ill," Margaret whispered to Sarah during their afternoon rest period. "Some kind of stomach complaint. She'll be confined to her room for at least 2 days. Possibly longer." This was significant because Mrs. Grayson was the only other staff member besides Dr. Kellner with access to the basement kitchen. During her absence, someone would need to prepare the enriched cereal batches. That evening, after dinner, Sarah approached Dr. Kellner in his office. She'd rehearsed what she would say, and she delivered her lines with carefully calculated enthusiasm. "Dr. Kellner, I've been thinking about our conversation after the purification session with Mr. Caldwell. I believe I understand now what you're trying to achieve. The removal of the corrupted self to reveal the pure soul beneath. It's not so different from surgery, removing diseased tissue to save the healthy organism." Kellner looked up from his papers, his blue eyes sharp and assessing. "Go on. I've been observing the patients more carefully, paying attention to who improves and who remains resistant. There's a correlation with the special batches of cereal, isn't there? You've formulated something that enhances the purification process." A smile slowly spread across Kellner's face. "I had hoped you would prove receptive to our methods, Miss Whitmore. Yes, the enriched formula contains additional nutrients that promote moral receptivity. Most minds cannot grasp the sophistication of what we're accomplishing here." "I'd like to learn more," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "With Mrs. Grayson ill, perhaps I could assist with the formula preparation. I understand basic chemistry from my training, and I'm eager to fully understand all aspects of our work." Kellner studied her for a long moment, and Sarah felt her entire plan teetering on the edge of this assessment. If he suspected her true intentions, if he saw through her performance. "Your timing is fortuitous," he finally said. "I do need assistance, and Mrs. Grayson is indeed quite ill." "Very well, Miss Whitmore. Tomorrow morning before breakfast service, you'll join me in the preparation room. But understand, what you see there must never be discussed with anyone outside this facility. The world is not ready for the full scope of our innovations. Do I have your word?" "Absolutely, Doctor. I understand completely." That night, Sarah barely slept. She'd gotten what she wanted, access to the basement kitchen, but now she had to figure out how to gather evidence without arousing suspicion. She had no camera, and even if she did, the basement had poor lighting. She would have to rely on her observations and perhaps take samples. At 5 o'clock the next morning, before any other staff were awake, Sarah met Dr. Kellner outside the basement stairwell. He carried a ring of keys and a lantern, which he lit before leading her down into the darkness. "The preparation of enriched formula requires privacy," he explained as they descended. "Lesser minds might misunderstand the process, might allow conventional morality to cloud scientific judgment." He unlocked the heavy door to his private kitchen, and Sarah entered a space that would haunt her nightmares for years to come. The room was larger than she'd expected, with stone walls and a ceiling supported by thick beams. The temperature was cold, probably to preserve materials, Sarah thought with a shudder. Along one wall stood industrial grinding equipment, the kind used in grain mills. Along another were tables with cutting implements, bone saws, and other tools that wouldn't have been out of place in a butcher's shop or a surgeon's operating theater. But it was the large wooden bins that drew Sarah's attention. Dozens of them, each labeled with dates and codes she didn't understand. Dr. Kellner moved to one of the bins and opened it, revealing what appeared to be dried grain. "The base material is simple wheat, processed into flakes," he explained, scooping some into a bowl. "Nothing revolutionary about that. But the enrichment, that's where genius meets necessity." He moved to a locked cabinet and opened it with another key. Inside were several large glass jars filled with a gray powder that looked disturbingly like ash. He carefully measured out a small amount and added it to the bowl with the grain flakes. "This is the key component," he said, his voice taking on a reverent quality. "Organic material processed to its most essential form. When consumed, it transfers properties from donor to recipient. The obedient become more obedient. The purified transfer their purity. It's not just nutrition, Miss Whitmore. It's transubstantiation through digestion." Sarah's throat tightened. She needed to ask, needed to confirm what she already knew. But the words caught in her mouth like hooks. "The organic material," she finally managed. "Where does it come from?" Dr. Kellner's smile was beatific. "From those who have completed their journey. Patients who have reached either the pinnacle of purification or the depths of irredeemable corruption. They continue to serve our mission even after their individual treatment concludes. Waste not, want not, Miss Whitmore. The human body is simply a collection of chemical compounds. Why should those compounds not be recycled for the benefit of others?" There it was. The confirmation spoken aloud, casual as discussing the weather. Dr. Kellner was grinding up human remains and feeding them to his patients, believing that this cannibalistic practice served some higher purpose. "How?" Sarah's voice cracked. She cleared her throat and tried again. "How do you process the material?" "Oh, the technical aspects are quite straightforward. First, the deceased is prepared using standard mortuary procedures, draining of fluids, removal of organs unsuitable for processing. The remaining tissue is desiccated in the drying chamber." He gestured to a small room Sarah hadn't noticed, with what appeared to be an oven of some kind. "Then ground to powder using the mills. The bone meal adds calcium, the organ tissue provides minerals, and the muscle tissue contains proteins that somehow, I haven't fully determined the mechanism, seem to carry behavioral characteristics. He was speaking about human bodies the way one might discuss agricultural products. The disconnect between his clinical tone and the horror of his words made Sarah's vision swim. "Are you feeling faint, Miss Whitmore?" Kellner asked, his voice sharp with concern. "Or was it suspicion?" "No, Doctor. I'm simply amazed by the sophistication of your methods." "Indeed. Now let me show you the proportions. Each batch requires precise measurements to ensure effectiveness without causing adverse physical reactions. Too much, and the patients become lethargic to the point of physical decline. Too little, and the behavioral modification is inadequate." For the next hour, Sarah watched and took mental notes as Dr. Kellner prepared multiple batches of his enriched cereal. He maintained careful records in a ledger, noting which patients would receive each batch, their current behavioral status, and the expected outcomes. The ledger also contained a separate column marked completed, which Sarah realized was his euphemism for patients who had been processed into powder. As they worked, Dr. Kellner grew expansive, clearly pleased to have someone to share his theories with. "The modern world suffers from excess of self," he explained. "Every individual believing their desires matter, their opinions deserve consideration. But what if we could create a society of truly moral beings, people who naturally submit to proper authority, who find happiness in obedience, who experience no conflict between duty and desire because their desires have been purified away?" "That's an extraordinary vision," Sarah said, because it was true, though not in the way Kellner meant it. The Ashcroft method could revolutionize society. Imagine prisons where inmates consume the processed remains of model citizens, gradually absorbing their law-abiding nature. Imagine schools where children's meals include the essence of history's greatest moral leaders. Within a generation we could eliminate crime, poverty, rebellion, all the ills that plague humanity. He wasn't mad in the conventional sense, Sarah realized. His logic was internally consistent, built on a foundation of beliefs about human nature and morality that weren't entirely unusual for the time. Plenty of people believed that diet affected behavior, that moral character could be improved through discipline and proper living. Dr. Kellner had simply taken these ideas to their logical and monstrous extreme. "Dr. Kellner," Sarah said carefully, "the patients who are processed, do their families know?" "Of course not. The grief-stricken are rarely capable of understanding higher purposes. They are told their loved ones have been transferred or, in cases of terminal decline, that death occurred from natural causes. The bodies are cremated in our own facility." He gestured to what Sarah had thought was a drying chamber. "And the ashes returned to families. Very tidy, very proper. And meanwhile, the essence of those individuals continues to serve our mission." Sarah felt sick but maintained her composure. She needed more information, needed to understand the full scope of the operation. "How many patients have been completed?" Kellner consulted his ledger. "Since opening Ashcroft 3 years ago, 27. Not a large number, but each one has contributed to the purification of dozens of others. The mathematics of moral multiplication are quite favorable. 27 people, 27 human beings murdered and processed into food. And the authorities had no idea because the families had been lied to, given ashes and death certificates and condolences." "What about staff?" Sarah asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "Do they ever consume the enriched formula?" Kellner's eyes narrowed slightly. "Why do you ask?" "I only wondered if the benefits might apply to staff as well, to help us better serve the mission." He relaxed. "An astute question. No, the enriched formula is reserved for patients requiring behavioral modification. Staff are selected for their existing moral fortitude, though..." He paused, studying her. If a staff member proved difficult, proved to be a source of disruption rather than support, then yes, they might benefit from the treatment. Or if beyond redemption, they might contribute to it in other ways. There was the threat, spoken plainly. Sarah had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed sent ice through her veins. I understand, Doctor, and I assure you I'm committed to the mission. Good. Now we must prepare these batches for distribution. Today's recipients include 3 new admissions who have shown early resistance, plus Mrs. Peterson, who continues to be problematic. I've increased her dosage significantly. If she doesn't show improvement within the week, we'll need to consider her completion. Mrs. Peterson, the woman Sarah had heard them discussing. A human being with thoughts and feelings and a life beyond these walls, about to be murdered and ground into powder because she refused to surrender her personality to a madman's vision. Sarah helped distribute the bowls to the appropriate patients' rooms, each one labeled with a patient number that corresponded to entries in Kellner's ledger. Mrs. Peterson's bowl contained cereal that was noticeably darker than the others. The increased dosage Kellner had mentioned. As Sarah set it on the woman's nightstand, Mrs. Peterson looked up at her with eyes that were still sharp, still aware. "Please," she whispered, "please help me. He's killing us. He's feeding us." "Shh," Sarah interrupted, glancing toward the door to make sure no one was listening. "I know. I'm going to help you, but you have to trust me. Don't eat this." "Hide it. Dispose of it somehow, but don't eat it." Mrs. Peterson's eyes widened with desperate hope. "You believe me? You know what he's doing?" "Yes, but you have to be careful. Pretend to be improving. Pretend to be more docile, or he'll—" Sarah couldn't finish the sentence. "Or he'll turn me into the powder," Mrs. Peterson completed. "I figured it out. The other patients, the ones who vanish, they're in the food, aren't they? We're eating each other." Sarah nodded, her throat too tight for words. "God in heaven," Mrs. Peterson breathed. "How many have I consumed? How much of this abomination is inside me?" "I'm going to stop him," Sarah promised. "But I need time. Can you hold on? Can you pretend?" "I'll try. But nurse, he's planning something. I've heard him talking with that Grayson woman. They're going to do a special session with several of us. Something about a group purification. If that happens—" "When?" "I don't know." "Soon. Within days, I think." Sarah squeezed Mrs. Peterson's hand briefly, then left the room before anyone could see them talking. Her mind raced. She had evidence now, not physical proof, but eyewitness testimony and her own observations. She had seen the grinding equipment, the human ash, the ledger documenting it all. But what could she do with this information? Going to the police seemed impossible. Dr. Kellner was respected, published, trusted by the families of his patients. Sarah was a nurse with no proof beyond her word against his. Even if she could somehow steal the ledger or samples of the powder, how would she get them off the grounds? And there was the matter of time. Mrs. Peterson and perhaps others were scheduled for completion within days. Sarah couldn't wait for outside authorities to investigate, even if she could convince them to do so. She would have to act alone. And soon. That afternoon, while Dr. Kellner was conducting purification sessions, Sarah sought out Margaret. "I need your help," she said without preamble, "and I need you to trust me without asking too many questions." Margaret studied her face, then nodded slowly. "What do you need?" "Access to Thomas Beck and matches, as many as you can gather without raising suspicion." "Sarah, what are you planning?" "I told you not to ask questions. And I told you I'd help, but I need to know if you're about to do something that will get us both killed." Sarah looked at her friend, this woman who had endured 8 months in this nightmare, and made a decision. Dr. Kellner is feeding his patients human remains. The gray cereal contains powdered tissue from patients he's murdered. I've seen his preparation room, his records. He's killed 27 people and plans to kill more within days. I'm going to stop him. Margaret's face went pale. For a moment, Sarah thought she might faint. Then her expression hardened. How? I'm going to burn the evidence. The basement kitchen, the processing equipment, the ledgers, all of it. And while everyone's distracted by the fire, I'm going to help as many patients as possible escape. That's insane. The place is stone, it won't burn easily. And where will the patients go? Most of them can barely function. I don't have a better plan, and I don't have more time. Will you help me or not? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. I'll help, but we're going to need more than matches. There's kerosene in the storage shed, used for the lamps, and we'll need to coordinate. Someone to cause a distraction while someone else gets the patients out. Over the next 2 days, Sarah and Margaret prepared their desperate plan. Margaret smuggled kerosene from the storage shed in small amounts, hiding it in cleaning supply bottles. Sarah identified the patients who were most capable of movement and rational thought. About 15 people who might be able to escape if given the opportunity. The rest were too far gone, too affected by months or years of Kellner's drugs and conditioning. It was a terrible calculus, deciding who could be saved and who would have to be left behind. But Sarah knew they couldn't evacuate the entire sanatorium without Kellner stopping them. On the third night, March 15th, 1894, Sarah waited until the night staff had made their rounds and most of the building was quiet. Margaret had managed to send Thomas Beck on an errand to the city, giving them a window where one fewer loyal staff member would be present. Sarah crept down to the basement carrying the cleaning bottles filled with kerosene. Her hands shook as she splashed the flammable liquid across the wooden work tables, the ledgers, the bins of grain and human powder. The smell was overwhelming in the confined space. She saved the grinding equipment for last, dousing it thoroughly. Then she struck a match. The flames caught quickly, racing across the trails of kerosene with hungry eagerness. Within minutes, the entire basement kitchen was ablaze, smoke beginning to rise toward the upper floors. Sarah ran. Upstairs, she found Margaret already alerting the patients they'd selected, helping them dress, preparing them to move. The fire alarm, a bell that had to be rung manually, began its clanging call. Chaos erupted. Staff members emerged from their rooms in various states of dress. Patients who hadn't been warned began panicking. Dr. Kellner appeared in the main hallway, his face a mask of fury when he saw Sarah and Margaret organizing an exodus. "What have you done?" he roared. "The formula, the records, you've destroyed years of research." "I've ended your murders," Sarah shot back. "These patients are leaving, Doctor." "Kellner, your experiment is over." He lunged toward her, but Francis and Robert, the orderlies, had already gone down to fight the fire. Kellner was alone, and Sarah had 15 patients beginning to move toward the main door. "You don't understand," Kellner said, his voice taking on a pleading quality that somehow made him more frightening. "I'm saving humanity. I'm creating a path to moral perfection. You can't just throw that away because of squeamishness about methods." "You're feeding people to other people," Sarah said. "There's no perfection in that. Only horror." Smoke was beginning to fill the upper floors now. They needed to move faster. But Mrs. Grayson appeared, no longer ill, carrying something that made Sarah's blood freeze, a revolver, small but deadly. "No one is leaving," she said calmly. "Dr. Kellner's work is too important. If you've destroyed the basement, then we'll simply have to start again. But we'll need fresh materials. Especially from those who've proven themselves enemies of the mission." The gun pointed at Sarah. In that moment, time seemed to slow. Sarah could hear the crackle of flames below, could smell smoke growing thicker, could see the faces of the patients behind her, some terrified, some too drugged to fully comprehend what was happening. She thought about her mother, about the promise of medicine, about the oath she'd taken to do no harm. Then Henry Caldwell, the railroad executive who'd been so broken down by Kellner's treatments, stepped forward. His face was still mostly blank, his movements still slow and mechanical. But his eyes showed something flickering back to life. "No," he said simply, and he walked toward Mrs. Grayson. "Stop," she commanded, raising the gun. He didn't stop. The gun fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Henry staggered but kept moving forward. He'd been hit, but the shot hadn't been immediately fatal. In the confusion, Margaret grabbed Sarah's arm. "Now, get them out now!" They shepherded the patients toward the main entrance. Behind them, they could hear Kellner shouting, Mrs. Grayson screaming. More shots fired, though Sarah couldn't tell if anyone else was hit. The cold March air hit them like a wall as they burst through the main doors. Snow crunched under their feet as they ran across the grounds toward the front gate. Sarah had stolen the key earlier, and her shaking hands managed to unlock it. "Go toward the city," she told the patients. "Find people. Tell them what happened here. Tell them everything." But most of them just stood there, shivering in their thin gowns, confused about where to go or what to do. Years of conditioning didn't disappear in a moment of liberation. "I'll lead them," Margaret said. "You need to make sure the fire's discovered, that someone official comes to investigate." Sarah nodded. "There's a house about a mile south. I saw it when I arrived. Get everyone there, tell whoever lives there that there's been a fire at the sanatorium. They'll help." Margaret gathered the patients and began leading them away into the night. Sarah turned back to look at Ashcroft. The building was starting to glow from within, light flickering in the windows as the fire spread from the basement. She could see figures moving inside, staff members trying to evacuate patients, or perhaps trying to save Kellner's research. She should go. She'd done what she came to do. The evidence was burning and patients were free, but she couldn't stop thinking about the ones still inside. The ones too drugged to move, too conditioned to save themselves. She'd made the choice to prioritize those who could be saved, but that didn't make it easier to abandon the rest. Sarah ran back toward the building. The heat hit her before she reached the door. The smoke was thick now, black and toxic. She pulled her apron up to cover her nose and mouth and pushed inside. The main hallway was chaos. Francis was trying to carry an elderly patient who could barely walk. Robert was beating at flames with a blanket. Dr. Kellner was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps he'd gone down to try to save his precious research. "Help me," Francis gasped when he saw Sarah. "There are 6 more on the second floor who can't move on their own." For the next 20 minutes that felt like hours, Sarah and the orderlies worked to evacuate as many patients as possible. The heat grew more intense. The smoke grew thicker. Sarah's lungs burned with each breath. On her 3rd trip to the second floor, she found Mrs. Peterson in her room, sitting calmly on her bed despite the smoke filling the space. "Come on," Sarah urged. "We have to go." "I ate some of it," Mrs. Peterson said quietly. "Before you warned me. Before I knew. I've been thinking about that. About how many people are inside me now. How many victims I've consumed. That wasn't your fault. You didn't know. Does that matter? They're still dead. Still part of me. It matters, and they'd want you to live. Please, Mrs. Peterson, come with me." Finally, the woman stood. They made their way down the stairs, now treacherous with smoke and heat. The main floor was nearly impassable, but they found a side exit that was still accessible. Outside, a crowd had gathered. The patients who'd escaped, some neighbors drawn by the flames, and Margaret, who'd returned after delivering the others to safety. "Where's Kellner?" Margaret asked. As if in answer, there was a tremendous crash from inside the building. Part of the second floor had collapsed into the first, sending up a column of sparks and flame that lit up the night sky. "He was in the basement," Sarah said. "Trying to save his records, his research. He didn't come out." They stood and watched Ashcroft burn. The fire brigade arrived eventually, but there was little they could do. The building was lost. In the chaos, no one noticed when Sarah slipped away, heading toward the stone outbuilding where she'd seen Thomas carrying something that night weeks ago. The door was unlocked, and inside she found what she'd expected but hoped not to see. a makeshift morgue with several bodies in various states of preparation for Kellner's processing. But there was also something else. A small desk with papers, copies of Kellner's notes, perhaps a backup of his research. Sarah gathered them all, along with several jars of the grey powder from a storage shelf. This was evidence, real, physical evidence of what had happened here. By the time she returned to the main group, the sun was beginning to rise, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of orange and red that matched the dying flames of Ashcroft. The authorities arrived, police, fire investigators, even a coroner. Sarah found the man who seemed to be in charge, a tired-looking detective named Walsh, and handed him the papers and jars. "You need to test this," she said. "It's human remains, ground into powder. Dr. Kellner was feeding it to his patients. And these documents prove it." Walsh looked at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Ma'am, you've been through a traumatic event. Perhaps you should rest." "I am a trained nurse with full command of my faculties," Sarah interrupted. "Test the powder. Read the documents. You'll find references to 27 patients who were supposedly transferred or who died of natural causes, but who were actually murdered and processed. There are bodies in the stone building beyond the main structure, people who were being prepared for the same fate." Something in her tone must have convinced him, because Walsh took the evidence and promised to investigate thoroughly. Over the following weeks, the full horror of Ashcroft emerged. The powder was tested and confirmed to contain human tissue. The bodies in the outbuilding were examined and matched to missing patients. Dr. Kellner's body was eventually found in the basement ruins, crushed by a collapsed beam. Whether he'd been trying to save his research or had been unable to escape was never determined. Mrs. Grayson survived and was arrested, though she maintained until her execution a year later that Dr. Kellner had been a visionary unfairly persecuted for his revolutionary ideas. Thomas Beck disappeared and was never found. The other staff members were questioned but ultimately not charged. Most, like Francis and Robert, seemed genuinely unaware of the full scope of Kellner's crimes. The patients who survived faced varying fates. Some were reunited with families. Others, too damaged by what they'd endured, were transferred to other institutions, hopefully more humane ones. A few, like Mrs. Peterson, simply vanished into the vastness of America, seeking to escape their memories. Sarah testified at multiple hearings and inquests. The story made national newspapers, though some details were deemed too disturbing for public consumption. Medical journals debated whether Kellner had been mad or evil, whether his theories about diet and behavior had any merit, even if his methods were criminal. But for Sarah, the questions were simpler. She'd gone to Ashcroft seeking to help people, to practice the healing arts. Instead, she'd discovered that the language of science and medicine could be twisted to justify almost any horror, that the pursuit of a better humanity could lead to the worst inhumanity imaginable. She never practiced nursing again. The trust required for that profession had been shattered. Instead, she took the money she'd saved and opened a small bookshop in Boston, where she could surround herself with ideas and stories without having to trust in the morality of their authors. Sometimes, late at night, she still thought about that cereal, the bland, flavorless grain that had promised purity and delivered damnation. She thought about Dr. Kellner's vision of a world where people consumed the essence of the obedient and became obedient themselves. And she wondered how many other monsters were out there, wearing the respectable clothes of progress, speaking the righteous language of improvement, all while feeding on the vulnerable in ways both literal and metaphorical. The Ashcroft Sanatorium was gone, burned to foundations that were eventually demolished and buried. But the ideas that had animated it, that humans could be perfected through control, that individual will was something to be suppressed rather than celebrated, that some people knew better than others how everyone should live. Those ideas survived. They always did. They always would. 6 months after the fire, Sarah sat in the office of Dr. Edmund Hartley, the physician assigned by the State Medical Board to evaluate the mental health of Ashcroft survivors. She'd resisted coming for weeks, but the nightmares had grown worse, and Margaret had finally convinced her that talking to someone might help. Dr. Hartley was everything Dr. Kellner had not been. Warm, patient, genuinely concerned with his patients' well-being rather than their compliance. His office was comfortable, with soft chairs and actual decorations on the walls. When he offered Sarah tea, it came with milk and sugar, radical luxuries after months of Ashcroft's austere diet. "Tell me about the guilt," he said gently, after they'd spoken for a while about the practical details of that night. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do. You blame yourself for the patients you couldn't save, for the ones who died in the fire, and for the ones who suffered before you discovered what Dr. Kellner was doing." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "There were 43 patients at Ashcroft when the fire started. I helped 15 escape immediately. We managed to evacuate another 12. 16 died, some from the fire, some from smoke, some from injuries sustained trying to flee. If I'd acted sooner, if I'd been smarter, faster, braver, if you'd been any of those things, you'd likely be dead." Dr. Hartley interrupted. "Miss Whitmore, you were one person in an impossible situation. You uncovered a horror that most people would have rationalized away or refused to believe. You acted with extraordinary courage, and you saved lives. The deaths that occurred were Dr. Kellner's responsibility, not yours." "But I ate the food," Sarah said, the confession bursting out. "For 2 weeks I ate that cereal every morning, standard batches, not the enriched ones, but still. I consumed what he prepared. What if some of it—" "The tests showed that the standard cereal was just grain," Dr. Hartley reminded her. "You know this." "But I didn't know it then. I ate it without questioning. I participated in his system, even if I didn't know the full truth." "You were trying to survive. You were gathering information. You did what you needed to do." Sarah shook her head. "There's something else. Something I haven't told the investigators or anyone." Dr. Hartley waited, his expression unchanging. "Henry Caldwell, the man who stepped in front of Mrs. Grayson's gun, who gave us time to escape. He'd been eating the enriched cereal for weeks. He was one of the most thoroughly conditioned patients, barely able to speak or think independently. And yet in that moment he chose to act. He chose to resist, which means some part of him was still there, still aware, still suffering through all those weeks of abuse. And that troubles you because I'd written him off. I'd looked at him and thought he was too far gone to save. I planned to leave him behind, but he saved us, and I would have abandoned him." Dr. Hartley leaned forward. "Miss Whitmore, you made tactical decisions under extreme pressure with limited information. Mr. Caldwell's moment of clarity doesn't invalidate those decisions. If anything, it suggests that even Dr. Kellner's most intensive conditioning couldn't completely destroy the human spirit. That should give you hope, not guilt." They talked for another hour, but Sarah left feeling unresolved. Dr. Hartley meant well, but he hadn't been there. He hadn't stood in that basement kitchen watching Kellner measure out human remains as casually as a baker measures flour. He hadn't seen the blank faces of patients who'd been systematically erased and rebuilt. He hadn't made the choice about who might be saved and who would be left behind. Outside Dr. Hartley's office, Sarah found Margaret waiting for her. They'd grown closer in the months since Ashcroft, bound by shared trauma and shared secrets. "How did it go?" Margaret asked as they walked through Boston's busy streets. "He thinks I need to forgive myself." "Do you?" "I don't know. How do you forgive yourself for being part of something so monstrous, even if you didn't know the full truth?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about that, about complicity and knowledge and responsibility. Most of the staff at Ashcroft were just trying to do their jobs. They believed they were helping people because that's what they were told. Does their ignorance absolve them?" "I don't know," Sarah repeated. "Neither do I. But I think about Francis and Robert, the orderlies. They helped us evacuate patients that night. They risked their lives. And yet they'd also participated in the purification sessions, held down patients during hydrotherapy, enforced Kellner's rules. Were they good people caught in a bad system, or bad people who happened to do good in a crisis? It was a question without a satisfying answer, which perhaps was the point. The world seemed to prefer stories with clear villains and heroes, but Sarah's experience had taught her that most people existed in the complicated space between. They stopped at a coffee shop, a real coffee shop, not the austere dining hall of Ashcroft. The smell of roasting beans and baking bread was intoxicating after months of bland cereal. They ordered generously, indulging in pastries and cream, asserting their freedom to choose pleasure. "I received a letter yesterday," Margaret said once they were seated, "from Mrs. Peterson. She's in California, working as a seamstress under a new name. She says she's learning to live with what happened, that some days are better than others." "Did she mention the nightmares?" "She didn't have to. We all have them." Sarah stirred sugar into her coffee, watching the crystals dissolve. "Do you ever wonder if Kellner was right about one thing? Not the cannibalism, obviously, but the idea that what we consume shapes who we become?" "In what sense?" "We spent weeks eating nothing but bland, joyless food, following rigid rules, suppressing our own instincts and observations. It did change us. Maybe not in the way Kellner intended, but we became more compliant, more willing to accept the unacceptable. It took extraordinary circumstances to break us out of that pattern." Margaret considered this. "So you're saying diet really does affect behavior?" "I'm saying that control over what people consume, whether it's food or information or ideas, is a powerful tool. Kellner understood that. He just took it to a monstrous extreme." "But we broke free," Margaret pointed out. "His control wasn't absolute." "No, but it was close. And if he'd been just a little smarter about hiding his crimes, if I hadn't overheard that conversation, if you hadn't been suspicious enough to track disappearing patients, he might have continued for years." The thought was chilling. How many other institutions might harbor similar horrors, hidden behind the language of treatment and progress? How many people might be suffering under systems they couldn't name or resist? Later that day, Sarah returned to her bookshop. It had become her refuge, this small space filled with stories and ideas. She'd arranged the shelves not by topic or author, but by theme. Books about freedom next to books about captivity, philosophy next to practical guides, fiction next to memoir. She wanted her customers to make unexpected connections, to see how different ideas spoke to each other across genres and generations. A young woman entered the shop, browsing the shelves with the intensity of someone seeking answers rather than entertainment. Eventually, she approached the counter where Sarah was cataloging new arrivals. "Do you have anything about the Ashcroft case?" the woman asked. "I'm a journalist, working on a follow-up story. I wanted to understand what happened there, beyond the sensational headlines." Sarah's first instinct was to refuse, to protect her privacy and her trauma. But then she looked at the woman's earnest face and remembered that silence had been part of what enabled Kellner's crimes. "I was there," Sarah said simply. "I was one of the nurses. What do you want to know?" The woman's eyes widened. I didn't expect." "Would you be willing to be interviewed? On the record?" "That depends on what story you're trying to tell. The truth, about what happened there, about how it was able to happen, about what it means for other institutions claiming to help people." Sarah thought about this. Most of the newspaper coverage had focused on the sensational aspects, the cannibalism, the murder, the fire. Very little had examined the systemic factors that made Ashcroft possible. The unquestioned authority given to doctors, the isolation of patients from family oversight, the assumption that institutional care was inherently better than home care. "Come back tomorrow," Sarah said. Bring your questions, and I'll try to answer them. But I want to review what you write before it's published." The journalist agreed and left. Sarah closed the shop early and walked home through Boston's autumn streets. Leaves crunched under her feet, and the air smelled of wood smoke, a scent that would probably never stop making her flinch. At home, she found another letter waiting, this one from Francis, the orderly. He'd moved to New York and found work at a hospital there. His letter was brief. "Miss Whitmore, I think about that night often, about how I helped Dr. Kellner with his sessions, believing I was part of something medical and proper. I tell myself I didn't know the full truth, but in my heart, I suspect I chose not to know. There were signs, weren't there? The disappearing patients, the locked basement, the strange behavior of those eating the special cereal. I chose to accept the explanations I was given, rather than ask harder questions. I'm writing to say I'm sorry, even though I know that's inadequate. I hope you're finding peace. I'm trying to, though I'm not sure I deserve it. Francis." Sarah read the letter twice, then filed it with others she'd received from Ashcroft survivors and staff. They would be part of the historical record, evidence that people had struggled with what they'd witnessed and what they'd done. Forgiveness was complicated, guilt was complicated, but perhaps the point wasn't to resolve these feelings neatly, but to live with them, to let them inform better choices going forward. That night, Sarah had the dream again. She was back in Ashcroft's dining hall, but this time she could see through the walls to Kellner's basement kitchen. She could see patients being ground into powder, see the powder mixed with grain, see the bowls distributed. And she was eating. They were all eating, consuming each other in a ritual that made less sense the more she understood it. She woke gasping, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets. This happened several times a week, and Dr. Hartley had explained it was likely to continue for years. Trauma didn't heal on a convenient schedule. But this time, instead of lying awake in dread, Sarah got up and lit a candle. She took out her journal, a new habit Dr. Hartley had recommended, and began to write. She wrote about guilt and complicity, about the difficulty of knowing when to speak up and when to stay silent, about the ways systems of authority can corrupt even good intentions. She wrote about Henry Caldwell's final act of resistance, about Mrs. Peterson's struggle to live with what she'd unknowingly consumed, about her own failures and fears. And she wrote about hope, the fragile, stubborn hope that understanding these horrors might prevent future ones, that telling these stories might help others recognize when healing has become harm, when authority has become abuse. By the time dawn light began filtering through her window, Sarah had filled a dozen pages. It wasn't resolution, but it was something, a way of carrying the weight that made it slightly more bearable. The journalist returned the next day, and over several sessions, Sarah told her story in full. The resulting article was published 2 months later, and it prompted other survivors to come forward with their own testimonies. A pattern emerged of institutions across the country where troubled individuals were isolated, controlled, and sometimes abused in the name of treatment. Reform was slow, as reform always is, but it began. Regulations were proposed, oversight mechanisms were strengthened, families were given more rights to visit and monitor their loved ones' care. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to undo what had been done. But it was something. And sometimes, Sarah learned, something was all you could manage. 2 years after the Ashcroft fire, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at her bookshop. It was a cool October afternoon, and she was arranging a display of new titles when a well-dressed woman in her 30s entered, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd had to relearn basic tasks. It took Sarah a moment to recognize her. Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, one of the patients she'd seen on her first tour of Ashcroft, the woman who'd sat motionless on her bed, staring at nothing. "Mrs. Thompson," Sarah said, surprise and concern mixing in her voice. How are you?" Please call me Eleanor, and I'm better. Much better, actually, though it's been a long road. Eleanor's smile was tentative but genuine. I wanted to thank you for that night, for not leaving us behind when you could have simply escaped. I did leave some people behind, Sarah said quietly. I couldn't save everyone. No one could have saved everyone. But you saved me, and I want you to know what that means. Eleanor moved closer, her eyes clear and focused in a way they hadn't been at Ashcroft. After the fire, I spent 6 months in another institution, a real one this time, where they actually tried to help rather than control. It took time to recover from whatever drugs Dr. Kellner was giving us. The doctors said I was lucky, that some patients never fully regained their cognition. And now? Now I'm living with my sister in Providence. I'm learning to paint. It helps with the memories, gives my hands something to do when my mind starts to drift. And I'm trying to reconnect with my children, though that's complicated. How so? Eleanor's expression darkened. They're angry with me for being away so long. My husband told them I was too ill to see them, that I needed time to recover. They were so young when I was committed, 5 and 7. Now they're older, and they don't really know me. My youngest asked if I was really his mother, or if I was someone pretending to be her. Sarah felt her throat tighten. The damage Kellner had done extended far beyond the patients themselves, rippling out through families and relationships. I'm sorry, she said. Inadequate words for an inadequate situation. Don't be. It's not your fault. If anything, you gave me the chance to rebuild it all. Some of the women I was with at Ashcroft weren't so fortunate. Eleanor paused, seeming to gather her courage. Miss Whitmore, Sarah, I came here because I need to ask you something. The memories from Ashcroft are fragmentary, clouded by whatever he was dosing us with. But there's one memory that won't leave me alone. The taste of that cereal he fed us. It was supposed to be bland, flavorless, but sometimes it had this undertone, I can't describe it. And I've started to wonder if what they said in the newspapers about what he was putting in the food, if that was real, or if I imagined it in my drugged state. Sarah understood the question beneath the question. Eleanor needed to know if she'd been forced to participate in cannibalism, if she carried that moral stain, whether she'd known about it or not. The enriched cereal, Sarah said carefully, contained organic material processed from deceased patients. Not all the cereal, only the batches given to patients Kellner deemed resistant. The standard cereal was just grain. How do I know which kind I was given? Sarah met her eyes directly. You don't. I'm sorry, but there's no way to know for certain. The records burned with the building, and what survived didn't always specify which patients received which batches. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. I think I knew, she finally said. Some part of me, beneath the drugs and the conditioning, I think I knew. That's why I've been having such trouble eating since then. Food tastes wrong now, tainted somehow. Even knowing logically that it's just normal food, my body remembers. Have you spoken to anyone about this? A doctor? A counselor? Dr. Hartley, yes. He's been helpful. But there's something about talking to someone who was there, who understands firsthand. Eleanor trailed off. How do you live with it? Knowing what you know? Sarah considered the question. Imperfectly. Some days are better than others. I've found that keeping busy helps, and that having a purpose, running this shop, helping when I can, makes it feel less overwhelming. And I've accepted that I'll probably always carry some of the weight of what happened. The question is whether that weight crushes you or grounds you. Which is it for you? Both, depending on the day. Eleanor nodded slowly. That's honest. I appreciate honesty. Too many people want to tell me I'll be fine, that time heals everything, that I should just move forward. But some things change you permanently, don't they? Yes. But change isn't always the same as damage. You're different now than you were before Ashcroft, but that doesn't mean you're broken. Even if I unknowingly consumed. Even then, you're not responsible for what was done to you. The guilt belongs to Kellner and those who enabled him. Eleanor's eyes glistened with tears. Thank you. That's what I needed to hear, I think, from someone who understands. They talked for another hour, sharing experiences and strategies for managing the ongoing aftermath of Ashcroft. When Eleanor finally left, she promised to stay in touch, and Sarah believed she would. That evening, as Sarah locked up the shop, she reflected on how her purpose had evolved. She'd wanted to be a nurse, to heal people through medicine. Instead, she'd become something different, a witness, a survivor, a person who understood a particular kind of trauma and could help others navigate it. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was meaningful in ways she hadn't anticipated. Over the following months, Sarah's bookshop became an informal gathering place for Ashcroft survivors. Word spread that she was there, that she understood, that she wouldn't judge or dismiss their experiences. They came in small numbers. A former patient working through the trauma of what they'd endured. A family member struggling with guilt over having committed a loved one to Kellner's care. Even a few other staff members seeking forgiveness or understanding. Sarah listened to all of them, offering what comfort and clarity she could. But she also began to notice patterns in their stories, common threads that suggested Ashcroft wasn't as unique as people wanted to believe. There was the man whose sister had been committed to an asylum in Pennsylvania and subjected to experimental treatments that left her unable to speak or care for herself. The woman whose brother had been sent to a moral reform school in Ohio, where boys who masturbated were subjected to increasingly severe punishments. The parents whose daughter had been institutionalized for rebelliousness and came home 6 months later, a shell of her former self. The specific methods varied, but the underlying pattern was the same. Vulnerable people isolated from support systems, subjected to treatments justified by moral or medical authority, harmed in the name of helping them. Sarah began collecting these stories, documenting them carefully. She wasn't sure what she would do with them, but she knew they needed to be recorded, needed to exist as evidence that these weren't isolated incidents, but symptoms of systemic problems. It was during this period that she received a letter from Margaret, who had moved to New York to work with a physician named Dr. Catherine Meyer. Dr. Meyer was pioneering more humane approaches to mental health care, emphasizing patient dignity and family involvement rather than institutional control. "You should come visit," Margaret wrote. "Dr. Meyer is interested in hearing your story, in learning from what happened at Ashcroft, so we can develop better models of care. She believes that patient testimony and survivor experiences should inform treatment approaches, which is revolutionary thinking in this field. I think you two would work well together." Sarah was intrigued but hesitant. She'd built a life in Boston, created a space where she felt safe and useful. Moving to New York, getting involved in medical reform work again felt risky, both emotionally and practically. But she also recognized that her bookshop, while valuable, was limited in its impact. She could help survivors one at a time, but she couldn't change the systems that created them. She decided to visit New York for a week to meet Dr. Meyer and see what she was building. Dr. Catherine Meyer's clinic was nothing like Ashcroft. It was smaller, located in a converted brownstone in Manhattan's growing immigrant neighborhoods. The walls were painted in warm colors. Windows let in abundant natural light. Patients moved freely, some sitting in common areas reading or talking, others working with staff on individual activities. The traditional asylum model is fundamentally flawed, Dr. Meyer explained as she showed Sarah around. It assumes that isolation from society is necessary for treatment, that control over every aspect of a person's life is therapeutic. But in my experience, people heal better with more freedom, not less, with connection rather than isolation. Sarah noticed a patient in the common room working on what appeared to be a complex mathematical problem, papers spread across a table. "He's allowed to pursue his own interests." Encouraged to, actually. Mr. Chen was a bookkeeper before his breakdown. Returning to mathematical work has been part of his recovery. It gives him a sense of continuity, of being more than just a patient. They sat in Dr. Meyer's office, drinking actual tea with sugar, while Margaret looked on proudly. "Margaret has told me about Ashcroft," Dr. Meyer said. "About what you witnessed there, what you did to stop it. But I want to hear it from you, if you're willing to share." Sarah talked for over an hour, describing not just the dramatic events of the fire but the subtle mechanisms of control that preceded it, the rigid routine, the bland diet, the psychological conditioning disguised as treatment. She talked about how difficult it had been to recognize that something was deeply wrong when it was wrapped in the language of medical science and moral improvement. "That's the insidious part," Dr. Meyer said when Sarah finished. "Dr. Kellner's specific crimes were extraordinary, but the underlying attitudes, that patients can't be trusted with their own recovery, that staff know better than individuals what they need, that compliance is more important than autonomy, those attitudes are common throughout the mental health field. So how do we change them? We build alternatives. We document what works and what doesn't. We train new doctors and nurses in different approaches. We include former patients in developing treatment methods, and we tell stories like yours so people understand what can happen when good intentions are corrupted by unchecked authority. Margaret mentioned you're interested in having me work with you. I am. I need someone who understands both nursing and the patient experience, someone who can help train staff and develop protocols, someone who has the moral courage to question authority when necessary." Dr. Meyer leaned forward. "I'm not going to pretend it's easy work or that we're changing the world overnight, but we're making a difference, one patient at a time, and I think you'd be good at it." Sarah thought about her bookshop, about the life she'd built. Then she thought about Eleanor Thompson struggling to reconnect with her children, about Francis's guilt-filled letter, about the patterns she'd seen in the stories survivors brought to her. "I'll need to close my shop, settle my affairs in Boston. It might take a month or two." Dr. Meyer smiled. "Take your time. We'll be here when you're ready." 3 months later, Sarah began her new position at Dr. Meyer's clinic. The work was challenging, training staff to listen to patients rather than just direct them, developing treatment protocols that balance structure with flexibility, advocating for patient rights against skeptical medical boards. But it was also rewarding in ways Sarah hadn't experienced since her nursing training. She was healing people again, but differently than before, by helping create systems that promoted healing rather than control. She also became involved in broader reform efforts. She testified before state legislative committees about the need for asylum regulation and family visitation rights. She contributed to articles in medical journals about the psychological effects of institutional isolation. She even co-authored a handbook with Dr. Meyer on humane approaches to mental health care, which was adopted by several progressive institutions. The work brought her back into contact with survivors of various forms of institutional abuse. Some were from Ashcroft, like Mrs. Peterson, who occasionally traveled to New York to speak at reform conferences. Others came from different backgrounds, but shared similar experiences of being controlled, diminished, and harmed in the name of treatment. 5 years after the Ashcroft fire, Sarah helped organize a gathering of survivors in New York. About 30 people came, ranging in age from teenagers to elderly individuals. Some had been institutionalized for mental health issues, others for what would now be recognized as simple nonconformity. Women who refused traditional domestic roles, men who expressed emotions too freely, children who asked too many questions. They shared their stories over the course of a weekend, creating a tapestry of abuse disguised as care. But they also shared strategies for recovery, for rebuilding lives that institutions had tried to erase. On the final evening, Sarah stood before the group and spoke about what she'd learned. "What happened at Ashcroft was extreme," she said, The cannibalism, the murders, those were uniquely monstrous. But the underlying dynamics that made it possible are not unique. They exist anywhere authority goes unquestioned, anywhere compassion is subordinated to control, anywhere people are seen as problems to be solved rather than individuals to be supported. She paused, looking at the faces before her. Survivors who had every reason to be bitter and broken, but who had instead chosen to fight for change. We can't undo what was done to us. We carry those experiences forever. But we can make sure they mean something. Every time we question abusive practices, every time we insist on patient dignity, every time we share our stories and refuse to be silenced, we're making it harder for future Dr. Kellners to operate. We're creating a world where vulnerable people have more protection, more support, more voice. That won't bring back the people we lost, someone called out. No, Sarah agreed. Nothing will bring them back. But it gives their suffering meaning. And it honors them by making sure others don't suffer the same way. After the gathering ended, Sarah returned to her small apartment in Manhattan. It was modest. One room with a kitchenette and a shared bathroom down the hall. But it was hers, chosen freely, a stark contrast to her assigned quarters at Ashcroft. She made herself a cup of tea, sweetened with honey and milk, and sat by the window watching the city lights. In 7 years, she'd gone from a promising nursing student to a survivor of horrors to an advocate for reform. It wasn't the path she'd planned, but it was a path with purpose. She thought about Dr. Kellner's vision, a world where human beings were perfected through control, where obedience was valued over autonomy, where consumption literally shaped consciousness. It was a vision that had consumed him as thoroughly as his patients had been consumed. And she thought about the alternative vision she was helping to build, a world where people were supported rather than controlled, where healing meant becoming more fully yourself rather than being reshaped according to someone else's ideal, where food was nourishment rather than a tool of manipulation. Neither vision would triumph completely. The world was too complex. Human nature too variable, institutional inertia too powerful. But progress was possible, one patient at a time, one reformed protocol at a time, one survivor's voice at a time. Sarah finished her tea and began preparing for the next day's work. There would be patients to see, staff to train, papers to write. The work was endless, but that was the point. Healing wasn't a destination but a process, something you committed to rather than completed. She'd learned that at the highest possible cost, in the darkest possible place. But she'd learned it, and that, finally, was enough. Outside her window, the city continued its endless motion, people coming and going, living their lives, mostly unaware of the battles being fought in clinics and asylums over how we treat those who struggle. But some knew. Some survivors and advocates and reformers were slowly changing the conversation, slowly shifting the balance from control toward compassion. It would take decades, Sarah knew, maybe generations. The impulse to control others for their own good was deeply woven into human society. But the counter-impulse, to trust, to support, to allow people their own paths even when those paths seemed difficult, that was deeply human too. The question was, which impulse would triumph in any given moment, in any given institution, in any given interaction between helper and helped? Sarah had made her choice. She would spend the rest of her life working to ensure that future patients had more choices than those at Ashcroft had been given. It was a small ambition in the grand scheme of things. But after Ashcroft, Sarah had learned to value small ambitions. Grand visions, she'd discovered, could justify almost anything. Small, persistent efforts to treat people with dignity, that was revolution enough. 20 years after the Ashcroft fire, Sarah Whitmore sat in a diner in Chicago, waiting for a meeting that had taken months to arrange. She was 46 now, with gray threading through her hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent witnessing difficult truths. Dr. Meyer's clinic had grown into a network of facilities across the Northeast, all operating on principles of patient dignity and family involvement. Sarah had become the director of training, traveling between sites and teaching new staff the difference between care and control. But she'd returned to Chicago for this specific meeting with a specific person, Thomas Beck, Dr. Kellner's former driver and assistant. Thomas was older too, his hair now completely gray, his face lined with what Sarah hoped was conscience. He'd reached out to her through an intermediary, saying he wanted to speak with her before he died. He had cancer, he'd explained in his letter, and limited time to make whatever peace he could with his past. He arrived 10 minutes late, moving slowly, and sat across from her in the booth with a heavy sigh. "Thank you for coming," he said. His voice was rougher than she remembered, worn down by time and illness. "I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't. But I've learned that healing sometimes requires facing difficult conversations." They ordered coffee. She took hers with cream, he drank his black, and for a moment neither spoke. "I need you to know," Thomas finally said, "that I knew. Not everything, not at first, but I knew something was deeply wrong. I helped him move bodies in the middle of the night. I helped him prepare the formula. I knew patients were disappearing, and I chose not to ask questions." "Why didn't you?" "Fear, partly. Dr. Kellner was intense, charismatic but frightening. And partly because I wanted to believe. He talked about creating a better world, about solving humanity's problems. I wanted that to be real, even when the evidence suggested otherwise." Sarah sipped her coffee, thinking about complicity and conscience, about the ways people rationalize participation in systems they know are wrong. "What happened to you after the fire?" she asked. "I disappeared, changed my name, moved west, tried to forget. But you can't really forget, can you? It follows you. I've spent 20 years looking over my shoulder, wondering if someone would recognize me, if there'd be consequences for what I'd helped him do. And now? Now I'm dying and I'm not even sure what I want. Absolution, maybe. Or just someone to acknowledge that it happened, that I was part of it, that I'm sorry." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus performative repentance. She'd become skilled at that assessment over the years. "I can't absolve you," she finally said. "That's not my place, and it wouldn't mean anything if I tried. But I can witness your regret. I can acknowledge that you're taking responsibility, even if belatedly. Is that enough? For whom? It won't bring back the people who died. It won't undo the trauma experienced by survivors. But it might be enough for you if you let it be." Thomas nodded slowly. "What happened there at Ashcroft? Do you think it could happen again? Somewhere else, some other doctor with a grand vision?" Sarah had thought about this question often over the years. Yes. Not exactly the same way, but yes. Anytime we give too much power to institutions, anytime we stop questioning authority, anytime we value compliance over autonomy, the conditions exist for abuse. The specific methods might change, but the pattern repeats. How do we stop it? Vigilance, transparency, laws that protect vulnerable people, systems that allow questioning without retaliation, cultural shifts that value informed consent over institutional control. She paused. "And people like you, finally willing to speak up about what they've witnessed or participated in, even when it's uncomfortable. Even 20 years too late? Better late than never. Your testimony could still be valuable. There are ongoing investigations into other institutions, other cases of suspected abuse. Your perspective as someone who worked within such a system could help others identify warning signs." Thomas looked uncertain. "You think I should go public? Confess everything? I think you should consider what would serve justice and healing most effectively. That might mean public testimony. It might mean private conversations with investigators. It might mean something else entirely. But hiding doesn't serve anyone, least of all you. They talked for another hour, Thomas describing in detail what he'd observed and participated in at Ashcroft. Some of it Sarah knew, but other details were new. The specific methods Kellner used to identify which patients to complete, the way he justified his actions with increasingly elaborate moral philosophy, the moments when Thomas had almost spoken up, but chose silence instead. When they finally parted, Thomas took Sarah's hand. "Thank you for listening. And for everything you've done since then. Margaret told me about your work, about the reforms you've helped implement. It's more than I've done. You're doing something now. That counts." Sarah watched him leave the diner, this man who'd been both enabler and victim of Dr. Kellner's vision. Then she paid for both their coffees and walked out into the Chicago afternoon. The city had changed dramatically since 1894. The World's Fair was a distant memory, replaced by new buildings, new industries, new waves of immigrants seeking opportunity. But some things remained constant. The human capacity for both great kindness and terrible cruelty, the tendency to rationalize participation in unjust systems, the difficulty of choosing principle over security. Sarah had learned all these lessons at Ashcroft, and she'd spent 2 decades trying to ensure others didn't have to learn them the same way. As Sarah stood on the Chicago street where her horrifying journey had begun 20 years ago, she thought about all the breakfasts she'd eaten since Ashcroft. Every morning meal was an act of assertion, choosing freely what to consume, taking pleasure in flavor and variety, refusing to let food be reduced to control or corruption. She'd learned that freedom sometimes tasted like sugar in coffee, like butter on bread, like spices and salt and all the pleasures Dr. Kellner had tried to eliminate. But she'd also learned that freedom was more than consumption choices. It was the right to question authority, to resist reshaping, to maintain one's essential self, even under pressure to conform. The patients of Ashcroft had been denied that freedom, told that their compliance was cure, their submission salvation, their consumption of the corrupted a path to purity. But some had resisted. Henry Caldwell in his final moment of clarity, Mrs. Peterson maintaining her awareness despite the drugs, the patients who'd questioned and doubted even when it put them at risk, and Sarah herself, who'd chosen investigation over acceptance, action over passivity, even when it would have been safer to stay silent. These resistances, small and large, were what prevented Ashcroft from becoming the template for future institutions. They were what made reform possible, what created space for more humane approaches to healing. As Sarah walked back to her hotel, she passed a cafe where a young family sat eating breakfast together, parents and children laughing over pancakes and fruit. Such an ordinary scene, made extraordinary by its contrast with her memories of Ashcroft's grim dining hall. This was what they'd fought for, she realized. Not grand revolutions or utopian visions, but simple freedoms. The right to eat pleasurable food with loved ones, to make choices about one's own care, to be treated with dignity even in moments of vulnerability. Dr. Kellner had wanted to perfect humanity through control, but he'd only created horror. The real path to betterment, Sarah had learned, came through respect for human autonomy, for individual difference, for the messy reality that people heal in their own ways and their own time. It wasn't a philosophy that would make headlines or inspire grand movements, but it was true, tested in the crucible of Ashcroft and refined through decades of patient care. And it was enough. Sarah smiled slightly, thinking of the young nurses she was training, the patients she was helping, the slow but steady progress toward more humane systems of care. She thought of survivors like Eleanor rebuilding their lives, of reformers like Dr. Maya creating alternatives, of former enablers like Thomas finally speaking truth. The work would continue long after she was gone. Other advocates would take up the cause, other survivors would share their stories, other institutions would be questioned and reformed. But for now, in this moment, walking through Chicago's afternoon sunlight, Sarah allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the naive hope of her youth, when she'd believed that medicine and science would inevitably make the world better, but a harder, more resilient hope, the kind that survives disillusionment and emerges stronger for it. The kind of hope that knows what humans are capable of, the worst and the best, and chooses to work toward the best anyway. The kind of hope that understands breakfast is never just breakfast, but a daily opportunity to choose nourishment over control, pleasure over punishment, freedom over fear. Sarah Whitmore had learned these lessons at the highest possible cost, but she'd learned them, and she'd spent 2 decades ensuring that others could learn them more gently, with less suffering, in systems designed to heal rather than harm. It was enough. It had to be enough. And in moments like this, bathed in autumn sunlight in a city that had witnessed both her trauma and her transformation, it actually felt like enough. She had one more meeting that evening, with a group of nursing students interested in mental health reform. She would tell them about Ashcroft, about what to watch for, about how to maintain their moral compass even in systems that pressure them to comply. She would tell them that being a healer sometimes means being a witness, that professional obligations sometimes conflict with ethical ones, that the courage to question can be more important than the willingness to obey. And she would tell them that change is possible, that institutions can be reformed, that every individual who chooses principle over convenience makes the world slightly better. They would listen with the earnest intensity of the young, and some would dismiss her warnings as outdated, and others would carry them forward into their careers. Sarah couldn't control which would be which. She could only plant the seeds and trust that some would take root. It was, after all, what she'd been doing for 20 years, planting seeds of doubt about unjust systems, of hope about better alternatives, of vigilance about the dangers of unchecked authority. Some had grown into reforms, some had withered, but enough had flourished to make the effort worthwhile. As Sarah prepared for her evening meeting, she thought one final time about Dr. Kellner's breakfast cereal, that bland mixture of grain and ground human remains. That physical manifestation of his philosophy that people could be perfected through consumption. It had been a monstrous idea, but like all truly dangerous ideas, it had contained a kernel of truth. What we consume does shape us, whether it's food or information or experiences. The question was whether that shaping would be chosen or imposed, whether it would honor individual humanity or attempt to override it. Sarah had made her choice 20 years ago in Ashcroft's burning hallways. She chose to fight for systems that respected rather than overrode, that supported rather than controlled, that trusted in people's capacity for their own healing. It had been the right choice then. It remained the right choice now. And it would be the right choice tomorrow when she would wake up, eat a breakfast of her own choosing, and continue the work of making sure that what happened at Ashcroft could never happen again. Not because such horrors were impossible, they remained all too possible in any system where power went unchecked, but because enough people now knew what to watch for, what to question, what to resist. And in that knowledge, carried forward by survivors and advocates and reformers, lived the best memorial to those who died at Ashcroft. The determination that their suffering would prevent future suffering, that their deaths would protect future lives. It was a memorial built not of stone but of vigilance, not of monuments but of moments when someone chose to speak up rather than stay silent. And it would endure as long as people remembered to ask, who benefits from this system? Who is harmed? And who has the power to change it? These were the questions Sarah Whitmore had learned to ask in the darkest place she'd ever known. And she would spend the rest of her life teaching others to ask them too. Because in the end, that was the only real defense against the Dr. Kellners of the world. A population educated enough to recognize when care becomes control, brave enough to resist when compliance is demanded, and compassionate enough to build better alternatives when the old systems prove corrupt. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, said a silent prayer for all who'd suffered at Ashcroft, and then opened them to face the future. There was work to do. There was always work to do. But tonight, at least, she would eat dinner of her own choosing, sleep in a bed she could leave any time she wished, and wake tomorrow to continue the fight for a world where everyone had the same freedoms. It was enough. It had to be enough. And miraculously, finally, it was. Now I don't have good news. I love to produce these videos, but creating them takes me a lot of time, and the only way I have to continue is to reach 1,000 subscribers, because this way I start receiving from YouTube. If you like our stories, do not let this channel die. Sign up and share our videos, since I am grateful.